The knock came at 7:18 on Christmas Eve, right when I had decided that cold sesame noodles eaten straight from the carton counted as dinner if I stood over the sink with enough confidence. My apartment was quiet except for the radiator hissing like it had a personal grudge and an old diner playlist coming from my laptop, all clattering plates and soft holiday songs from a place that did not exist anymore. I had meant to clean my toolbox. That was the lie I had told myself when I set it on the kitchen table 2 hours earlier, opened it, stared at the screwdrivers, and then spent the rest of the evening avoiding the silence by rearranging the same 6 wrenches. Across the hall, I could hear the muffled rhythm of someone moving fast, cabinets opening, a door shutting, footsteps stopping and starting again. That meant Tess Navarro was either late for something, angry at something, or saving someone from something. And with Tess, those 3 categories overlapped more than she would admit. I was not expecting anyone. That was part of the plan. Christmas Eve had become easier when I stopped letting it surprise me, when I kept the lights low, the phone face down, and the food simple enough that nobody could accuse me of trying. My sister Lenora had called earlier, and I had let it go to voicemail because she had kids now and a real holiday, the kind with wrapping paper in the carpet and somebody crying because a toy needed batteries. I told myself I was doing her a favor by not making her hear the empty parts of my apartment. That was the kind of math I was good at. Subtract yourself first and call it kindness. The knock came again, harder this time. 3 sharp hits, no hesitation, no polite little pause after. I set the carton down and looked through the peephole. Tess stood in the hallway wearing dark jeans, winter boots, and a thick cream sweater under a half-zipped coat, with the collar of her navy ER scrubs showing at the neck like she had changed outfits without finishing either life. Her hair was pinned up badly, the way it got when she had worked too many hours and stopped caring about symmetry. In one hand, she held her phone. In the other, she held a roll of silver duct tape like a weapon. I opened the door and said that whatever was leaking, sparking, or making a noise it should not make, I charged extra on holidays. Tess did not smile, which was the first sign this was worse than a stuck garbage disposal. She looked over my shoulder at the takeout carton, then at the toolbox on my table, then at me. Her eyes did that thing I hated and liked at the same time, where they took inventory without asking permission. "Get your coat," she said. "You're coming with me." I blinked at her. That's a complete sentence, but not an explanation. She pushed past the joke like she had no room for it. The community shelter on Halstead had a Christmas Eve dinner starting in less than an hour, she told me, and the main oven kept dying every time they loaded it. The warming cabinet was tripping a breaker, half the potatoes were still cold, and Mara was one bad update away from threatening a volunteer with a ladle. I asked who Mara was, even though I knew. Tess had mentioned her cousin enough times through the wall and by the mailboxes for me to understand that Mara Velez ran that shelter the way other people ran small countries. Tess said Mara was the only person in Chicago currently closer to violence than she was, which did make the duct tape feel more reasonable. I leaned against the door frame and tried to keep my tone light. "So this is a kidnapping with a service call." Tess finally gave me half a smile, but it did not stay. She said she would call it a rescue if that made my masculinity easier to manage. I told her my masculinity was doing fine beside my noodles. That was when her gaze dropped again, not judgmental, just too soft. She noticed the single carton, the unopened beer, the toolbox I had been pretending had a purpose, and the dark window behind me where the city was doing Christmas without me. Tess had been my neighbor for 8 months. She had borrowed my socket wrench once, left soup outside my door when I had the flu, and yelled at me through the wall when my smoke alarm started chirping at 3 in the morning. We were friendly in the dangerous way people become friendly when they learn each other's routines by accident. "You can say no," she said, but her voice changed when she said it. That was the problem. Tess was direct with everyone else, almost offensively efficient, but sometimes with me she put a second meaning under the words and left it there like a key under a mat. I asked if she was actually giving me a choice, and she looked down the hallway, toward the elevator, then back at me. She said the guests were already arriving, kids included, and the shelter had promised a real dinner, not granola bars and apology speeches. Then she added, quieter, that she saw my light on. I told her a lot of people had lights on. She said not everyone looked like they were trying to disappear inside one. I should have made another joke. That was what I usually did when someone got too close to the truth. I was Bram Calder, the man people called when a freezer failed at midnight or a dishwasher flooded a kitchen 5 minutes before opening. I knew how to keep my hands busy and my face unreadable. Before appliance repair, I had cooked on a line in my father's diner until the bills outlasted the customers and the customers outlasted my father. After the diner closed, I learned that if you could fix things, people were grateful for exactly as long as the thing stayed fixed. That was a simple arrangement. Clean, no promises. Tess stepped closer, and the hallway light caught the tired shadow under her eyes. She had probably come straight from the hospital before the shelter, because that was the kind of impossible schedule she treated like a personality trait. She told me she was not asking me to save Christmas. She just needed someone who could tell a breaker from a bad thermostat and would not panic because a room full of hungry people was waiting. I asked why she did not call a company. She gave me a look that said I had insulted both her intelligence and the calendar. Every decent repair service was either closed, booked, or run by someone currently drinking eggnog with both hands. Then she lifted the duct tape slightly and said she was down to prayer, violence, and me. That got me. Not the emergency. Exactly. I had spent enough years around kitchens to know that Christmas dinner could be held together by foil, stubbornness, and one person willing to crawl behind hot equipment. What got me was that Tess looked strong in the doorway, as always, but not untouched. Her fingers were red from cold. Her breath was still uneven, like she had run up the stairs instead of waiting for the elevator. And beneath the command in her voice, there was a request she was trying not to make too obvious. Do not make me go back there alone. I looked back into my apartment. The noodles had already gone glossy and sad in their carton. The playlist had moved into a song my father used to whistle while wiping down the counter after closing, back when I still believed hard work could keep every door open if you loved the place enough. My coat hung on the chair beside the toolbox. Tess watched me notice it. She did not beg. That was another thing about her. She would drag you into a blizzard before she let you see her ask twice. I said I needed 2 minutes. Tess exhaled like she had been holding her breath through the whole hallway. Then she recovered and told me I had one, because apparently mashed potatoes were a timed hostage situation. I closed the door long enough to pull on boots, grab my tool bag, and change out of the sweatshirt with a stain from lunch that I had been pretending was too small to matter. In the bathroom mirror, I looked less like a man enjoying solitude and more like a man caught lying to himself by a nurse with duct tape. I splashed water on my face, ran a hand through my hair, and told my reflection not to read too much into the fact that Tess Navarro had noticed I was alone. When I stepped back into the hall, Tess was pacing by the elevator, phone pressed to her ear. She was telling someone named Mara that she had found a solution, and no, the solution was not illegal unless the city had very specific opinions about extension cords. When she saw me, her eyes moved over my coat, my boots, the tool bag in my hand. For half a second, her face changed. Relief came through first, quick and unguarded, and then something warmer that she hid by reaching for the elevator button too aggressively. She told Mara they were on their way, then ended the call and looked at me like she was trying to decide whether to say thank you or make fun of my boots. I saved her the trouble and said the boots were vintage. She said they were tragic. I told her they had survived worse winters than her opinion. That made her smile for real, and the hallway felt less like a hallway for a second. We rode down in the old elevator with our shoulders close enough that the sleeve of her coat brushed mine every time the cables shuddered. She smelled faintly like hospital soap, winter air, and something cinnamon that probably came from the shelter kitchen. I stared at the floor numbers because looking at her reflection in the dull elevator doors felt like doing something I had no right to do. Outside, Chicago had gone silver and gold under falling snow. A rideshare idled at the curb, its windows fogged, the driver looking like he had already regretted accepting the fare. Tess hurried toward it, slipped once on the packed snow, and I caught her by the elbow before thinking. She went still under my hand, just for a heartbeat. Then she looked at my fingers wrapped around her sleeve and said my reflexes were annoyingly useful. I let go because I had to, and told her usefulness was part of my tragic brand. She opened the car door but paused before getting in, turning back toward me with the streetlight behind her, and worry coming through all the parts of her face she usually kept organized. There's one more thing, she said. I knew immediately that no good sentence in human history had started that way outside a parked rideshare. I asked if the oven was possessed, if Mara owned a snake, or if the shelter was secretly on a boat. Tess did not laugh this time. She looked down at her phone, then up at me, and said Dane Rusk was going to be there. The name meant nothing to me until she added that Dane was her ex-fiancé, the hospital administrator who had helped sponsor the dinner and who still liked appearing at her events as if generosity had visitation rights. I stood there with snow landing on my coat collar, tool bag heavy in my hand, and understood all at once that the broken oven was only part of the emergency. Tess had not just come for my tools. She had come because something about tonight was too heavy to carry by herself, and for reasons I did not trust myself to examine yet, she had crossed the hall and chosen my door. The rideshare smelled like wet floor mats, peppermint gum, and the driver's very serious commitment to holiday jazz. Tess slid into the back seat first, still looking at her phone like she could intimidate the shelter kitchen through the screen. I got in beside her with my tool bag between my boots, and for a few blocks neither of us said much. Snow dragged white lines across the windows. The city outside looked softer than it was, all gold lights and storefront wreaths and couples moving fast under shared umbrellas. Tess kept typing with both thumbs, then deleting, then typing again. I finally asked if she was texting Mara or threatening the oven directly, and she said both would be more productive than texting Dane. I did not ask about him right away. That surprised me. Usually, curiosity was my cheapest bad habit, especially when someone introduced an ex-fiancé into a moving car like a weather warning. But Tess's jaw was tight, and her shoulders had climbed toward her ears, and I could tell that whatever Dane Rusk was, she had already had enough of him before I ever heard his name. So I asked what kind of oven it was. That made her blink, like I had opened a door she expected me to walk past. She described it as old, oversized, and temperamental, which sounded like half the equipment I had known in my father's diner. I asked if it was gas or electric, whether the breaker tripped only under load, and whether anyone had smelled burning plastic. Tess stared at me for a second, then said this was the most romantic conversation anyone had ever had with a dying appliance. I told her appliances liked to feel seen. She laughed, and the tension in the car loosened by one notch. The shelter was on Halstead, in an old brick building wedged between a closed laundromat and a corner store with neon beer signs in the window. Paper snowflakes covered the inside glass. A crooked banner over the entrance said Christmas Eve dinner, and through the doors I could see movement everywhere. Volunteers in red aprons, kids in puffy coats, folding tables with plastic cloths, steam that should have been coming from food but looked more like panic. Tess was out of the car before I had both boots on the sidewalk. She turned back only once to make sure I followed, and I hated how good that felt, being expected. Inside, warmth hit me first, then noise. Not cheerful noise exactly, though there was plenty of that. It was the sound of too many people trying to make a good thing happen, with not enough time. Someone was dragging chairs across the floor. Someone else was untangling lights from a fake garland. A little boy in a dinosaur sweatshirt was guarding a tray of rolls like he had been personally assigned national security. From the kitchen came a woman's voice saying that if one more person opened the oven door to check, she was going to put them in it. Tess called out Mara's name, and the voice answered that she hoped Tess had brought either a technician or a priest. Mara Velez came out of the kitchen with her sleeves rolled up, silver hair tucked under a red scarf, and an expression that made me understand immediately why Tess had described her as close to violence. She was shorter than Tess, but somehow took up more space, the way some people do when they have spent years being the person everyone runs to. Tess introduced me as Bram from across the hall, then added that I fixed restaurant equipment and had poor self-preservation instincts. Mara looked me over, from my tool bag to my boots to the way Tess stood a little too close beside me, and said she loved a man with both tools and bad judgment. Tess told her not to start. Mara said she had not started anything. She was simply observing the arrival of a neighbor in a snowstorm on Christmas Eve. I liked her immediately and feared her a little, which seemed like the correct balance. The kitchen looked like a battlefield staged by a catering company that had lost hope halfway through. Aluminum trays covered every flat surface. A mountain of mashed potatoes sat under foil beside green beans that still looked too confident. Two volunteers were arguing gently over gravy thickness, and a teenage kid was fanning a smoke detector with a paper plate even though nothing was smoking. The main oven stood against the back wall, wide and stainless steel, its little red indicator light flickering like it was considering death as a lifestyle. I asked everyone to stop touching it, which made 3 people remove their hands from things at once. Tess hid a smile behind her phone. I got down on one knee and started with the breaker panel, then the cord, then the back access. The oven was not dead. It was worse than dead. It was inconsistent. In my experience, inconsistent machinery had a sense of humor and no moral center. While I worked, Tess moved around me like she had been built for crisis. She checked trays, answered questions, calmed one volunteer who had apparently dropped 20 rolls, and crouched beside a woman in a wheelchair to explain that dinner was still happening, just with a little dramatic tension. Everybody called her name. "Tess, where do these go? Tess, do we have more cups? Tess, Mara needs you." Tess answered all of it. Not once did I hear anybody ask whether she had eaten. That was when Dane Rusk arrived. I knew it before anyone said his name because the room changed in the small, irritating way rooms change when a polished man walks in expecting to be recognized. He wore a charcoal coat, expensive gloves, and the kind of scarf that looked less warm than strategic. He greeted Mara first, then a donor near the front table, then Tess, saving her for last like an entrance cue. His smile was calm enough to pass for kindness if you did not watch his eyes. Tess straightened when she saw him, not much, but enough for me to notice from behind the oven. Dane asked if everything was under control, and Tess told him it would be. He glanced toward the kitchen, then toward me, still half kneeling with a screwdriver in my hand and dust on my sleeve. He asked, in a voice built for meetings, whether this was the professional solution. Tess said I was Bram Calder and that I knew what I was doing. Dane repeated my name like he was testing the weight of it and found it inexpensive. Then he said it was generous of her neighbor to help, but a shelter full of guests probably needed more than some apartment repair guy improvising near a commercial oven. There were moments in my life when anger showed up loud. This was not one of them. This one came in clean and cold. I could have stood up and made a speech. I could have explained my years on diner lines, the repairs I had done for restaurants that would have folded for the night without me, the fact that men like Dane usually called men like me only when the expensive plan stopped working. Instead, I looked at Tess first. She was embarrassed, not for me, but because he had said it in her room, in front of her people, as if helping her meant owning the right to correct her. So I turned back to the oven and told Dane he was right about one thing. Improvising was bad, unless you understood what you were improvising around. Then I asked one of the volunteers to kill the left warmer, had Mara move 2 trays to the smaller unit, and reset the breaker after giving the oven 5 minutes to cool under no load. The red light steadied. The fan kicked in with an ugly but promising hum. I watched it for 10 seconds, then 20. Heat climbed. Not perfect, but enough to work with. I told Mara she had a window if nobody got curious, and opened the door every 30 seconds. Mara clapped once and yelled to the room that curiosity was now a punishable offense. Tess looked at me from across the kitchen, and the relief on her face did something I was not ready for. It was not just gratitude. Gratitude was quick and polite and easy to survive. This was slower. This was Tess seeing me in the middle of a room full of people and letting herself look like she had been waiting for me to show up. I wiped my hands on a towel because I needed something to do with them. Dane said nothing for a beat, then offered to check on the donor table. It was impressive how much retreat a man could fit into good posture. For the next 40 minutes, the shelter became controlled chaos instead of uncontrolled disaster. That was an upgrade. I adjusted a warmer, tightened a loose handle on a serving cart, and talked the teenage kid with the paper plate into becoming my unofficial door guard for the oven. Tess kept appearing beside me at exactly the right moments, handing me a flashlight, a clean towel, a bottle of water I did not remember asking for. Once, our hands closed around the same roll of tape, and we both paused like idiots over adhesive. She recovered first, telling me not to get sentimental because the tape was shelter property. I told her I had strict boundaries with office supplies. When the first trays finally made it to the serving line, The room changed again. People settled. Kids stopped asking when food would happen because food was happening. Mara moved past me carrying a bowl of cranberry sauce and muttered that if I ever needed a place to hide a body, she knew several freezers. Tess told her that was not how community outreach worked. Mara said community had many forms. I was still laughing when an older woman with bright eyes and a knitted purple hat touched my arm from her seat near the kitchen entrance. She asked if I was the young man Tess had been talking about. I looked at Tess. Tess looked at the ceiling like it had betrayed her. I asked the woman what Tess had said, because apparently I had no survival instincts at all. The woman smiled and said only good things, mostly that I fixed things, lived across the hall, and looked lonelier than I acted. Tess made a small sound that might have been my name and might have been a warning. Then the woman patted my sleeve and said it was nice that Tess had finally brought her boyfriend to dinner. The word boyfriend landed between us with more heat than the oven. I waited for Tess to correct her. Tess opened her mouth, glanced at me, then glanced away, and she waited 1 second too long. That 1 second should not have mattered. People hesitate for harmless reasons all the time. They are tired, distracted, trying not to correct someone too sharply, trying to keep a dinner line moving before the gravy skins over. I knew all of that. I also knew Tess Navarro, and Tess was not a woman who lacked quick corrections. She could stop a volunteer from stacking hot pans wrong from across the room with only one eyebrow. She could hear a child opening the kitchen door behind her and say, without turning, that unless they had a food handler's certificate and a sincere apology, they needed to back up. So when the woman in the purple hat called me Tess's boyfriend and Tess let the word sit there for a full breath, my brain became a very stupid place. Tess recovered by handing the woman an extra roll and saying I was her neighbor, which was technically true and emotionally useless. The woman smiled like she had lived long enough to respect technicalities while ignoring them. I went back to tightening a loose handle on the serving cart because handles made sense. Handles were honest. If they were loose, you tightened them. If they broke, you replaced them. They did not look at you across a crowded shelter kitchen like they had almost admitted something and then hide behind dinner rolls. The next hour pushed us into a rhythm neither of us had agreed to, but both of us followed. Tess called out what needed moving, and I moved it. I told her which trays could go in together without murdering the oven, and she rearranged the whole serving order without complaining once. A volunteer handed me a pan that was too hot. Tess saw my fingers jerk, and before I could make it a joke, she had my hand under cold water at the prep sink. I told her I had survived worse. She told me men had built entire civilizations on saying that right before infection. Then she wrapped 2 of my fingers in a strip of gauze from the first aid kit she seemed to produce from nowhere. I said ER nurses were just magicians with worse lighting. She said appliance repairmen were just raccoons with invoices. By then, the kitchen had accepted me as part of its temporary ecosystem. The teenage oven guard, whose name was Luis, saluted me every time I checked the temperature. Mara kept calling me Neighbor Bram, in a tone that made the title sound legally significant. Tess pretended not to hear it, but every time Mara said it, Tess found a reason to turn toward the shelves or the sink. I learned that Tess did that when she was embarrassed. Not big embarrassment, not the kind that made her lose control. The smaller kind, the kind that warmed the back of her neck and made her move faster than necessary. I should have been tired. I should have wanted to fix the oven, finish the job, and go back to my apartment where nothing asked anything of me. Instead, I kept noticing things. Tess lifting her hair off her neck with the back of her wrist because her hands were messy. Tess crouching beside a little girl who had spilled cider and making it feel like a small weather event instead of a disaster. Tess taking the smallest piece of cornbread from a tray because she thought no one saw. Tess looking for me across the kitchen before she called out a decision. Not because she needed permission, but because she had started trusting my answer. That was worse than being needed. Being needed was simple. Being trusted had edges. At one point, when the warming cabinet started making a rattling sound like it was full of angry coins, Tess and I ended up shoulder to shoulder behind it, both of us half-crouched in a space designed by someone who had never met adult humans. She held the flashlight while I checked the back panel. The beam shook once, and I glanced over. Her face was closer than I expected. close enough for me to see a faint smear of flour near her cheekbone and the tiny pulse at the base of her throat. I told her she had flour on her face. She said that was impossible because she had been too busy preventing structural collapse to enjoy baking. I reached up without thinking and brushed it away with my thumb. The second I did it, the cabinet could have exploded and I would not have noticed first. Tess went still. Her eyes lifted to mine, and the flashlight beam dropped to the floor, throwing our shadows huge and crooked against the wall. I said her face had been in distress and I was offering maintenance. Her mouth curved, but the smile did not rescue either of us. She said softly that I made everything sound repairable. I told her that was the business model. She looked at my bandaged fingers, then at the tool bag beside my knee, then back at me. "Is that all it is?" she asked. I did not answer fast enough. Luckily, the warming cabinet rattled again, giving me something mechanical to blame for my silence. I adjusted the loose fan guard and told her the machine was dramatic, but not dying. Tess said she knew the type. The way she said it made me wonder if we were still talking about the cabinet. Later, Mara sent us into the storage room for extra napkins because apparently napkins were the backbone of civilization. The storage room was narrow, stacked high with donated coats, paper goods, canned cranberry sauce, and boxes labeled in 3 different handwriting styles. The noise from the dining hall softened behind the door. For the first time since we had arrived, Tess and I were not surrounded by people asking for things. She leaned back against a shelf and closed her eyes for 2 seconds, maybe 3. It was the first time I saw the night hit her body, not her face, because Tess could command her face. Her shoulders gave her away. I found the napkins on the top shelf, passed them down, and then noticed one of the metal brackets sagging under a box of canned vegetables. I took out my pocket driver and started tightening it. Tess opened her eyes and stared at me. I asked what. She said she had brought me into a shelter emergency and somehow I was doing unpaid shelf maintenance in captivity. I told her gravity did not observe holidays. She did not laugh this time. She stepped closer, the package of napkins held against her chest, and asked if I ever stopped fixing things long enough to let people like me. That hit cleaner than Dane's insult because it did not come from a man trying to make me smaller. It came from someone who had been watching too closely. I told her people liked working equipment and hot food, and I was in favor of both. Tess shook her head and said that was not what she asked. I tried another joke, something about my personality being under manufacturer warranty, but she did not let me hide in it. She said I did that every time. I made myself useful, then acted like the usefulness was the whole reason anyone wanted me around. I looked down at the screwdriver in my hand. The truth was embarrassing in its simplicity. When my father got sick, I fixed the diner. When the bills got worse, I fixed the schedule. When the walk-in freezer failed, I fixed the freezer. When none of that saved the place, people still told me I had done everything I could, which sounded kind until you realized everything I could had not been enough. Since then, being useful had been the safest shape I knew how to take. Nobody could reject a man while he was solving their problem. They waited until after. Tess must have seen some version of that on my face, because her voice changed. She said she did not knock because I was useful. I looked up then. The room was too small, the shelf too close, the air smelling faintly of cardboard and cinnamon and winter coats. She told me she knocked because she hated the thought of me sitting alone across the hall, pretending that was what I wanted. The oven gave her an excuse, she admitted, but it was not the reason. The reason was that she had wanted to knock before, more than once. She said it like the confession cost her something. I could have ruined it by calling it neighborly concern. I almost did. The old instinct rose fast, protective and cowardly. But Tess was looking at me with no performance in her face, and for once I did not want to insult both of us by pretending I misunderstood. I said her name quietly, not because I had a sentence ready, but because her name was the only honest thing I trusted myself with. Tess's eyes dropped to my mouth for one unhidden second. Then she looked back up, and all the noise outside seemed to move farther away. The storage room door opened hard enough to bump the shelf behind me. Dane stood there with his phone in one hand and his polite disaster face already arranged. He looked from Tess to me, then to the screwdriver still in my hand, and smiled like he had walked in on something he planned to describe differently later. He said he hated to interrupt whatever this was, but the main oven had cut out again. Then he added that his restaurant contact was still available, if Tess was finally ready to accept a real backup plan. Tess went very still beside me. I picked up the napkins because somebody had to, and because my hands needed a reason not to become fists. Dane had a talent for making help sound like a verdict. He stepped into the kitchen behind Tess with his phone already lifted, the screen bright in his palm like evidence. He said he had spoken to a restaurant owner he knew in River North, a man who owed the hospital foundation a favor, and they could send over trays within 40 minutes if Tess wanted to stop gambling with old equipment and make the responsible choice. The way he said responsible did not land on the oven. It landed on Tess. Around us, the kitchen noise thinned just enough for everyone to understand that this was no longer only about dinner. Tess took the napkins from my hand and set them on the prep table with careful control. I had seen her move fast all night, but now she went still in that particular way people do when they are deciding how much of themselves they can afford to show. Mara stood near the serving line with a tray of carrots in both hands, eyes narrowed. Luis, my teenage oven guard, looked from Dane to Tess to me like he was watching a sport he did not know the rules for but wanted someone to win. Dane kept his voice calm, almost kind, and explained that the guests should not suffer because Tess wanted to prove she could handle everything herself. That was the cleanest blade he had used so far. The worst part was that his plan would probably work. Food was food when people were hungry, and Tess cared about the guests more than she cared about being right. I could see the decision forming in her face, not because she agreed with him, but because she was willing to swallow humiliation if it kept the room fed. That was the part Dane understood about her. He knew where to press. He knew she would sacrifice herself before she let anyone else pay for her pride, and he was polished enough to call that concern. I stepped past him without answering and went back to the oven. The red light was dead again, but the fan had not fully quit, which mattered. The smell was not burnt wiring. It was heat stress and a tired circuit being asked to carry too many things at once. I checked the panel, then the warming cabinet, then the old extension line somebody had run behind the prep table before I arrived. It was not pretty, but it was understandable. The oven was not failing alone. The entire kitchen had been wired like a Christmas miracle and a fire marshal's nightmare. I told Tess I could buy her the night, but not if everyone kept running the oven, the warmer, the coffee urn, and the extra hot plate on the same overloaded leg. She came closer immediately, not because she was clinging to me, but because I had given her a concrete problem instead of a judgment. I explained that if we shifted the coffee urn to the hallway outlet, killed the left warmer, held the rolls under foil instead of heat, and cooked the remaining trays in smaller loads, the main oven should stop tripping long enough to finish service. It was not elegant. It was diner logic, the kind my father used when 3 things broke and 20 people still expected breakfast. Dane gave a small laugh and said that sounded like a lot of hoping. I told him hope was part of it, but amperage was doing most of the work. Mara made a sound behind me that might have been a laugh and might have been a prayer. Tess looked at the oven, then toward the dining hall where people were already eating the first round of food, then at Dane's phone. For 1 second, I thought she was going to choose the restaurant delivery, and if she had, I would have understood. I would have gone back to being useful in whatever smaller way remained. Instead, Tess lifted her chin and told Mara to move the coffee urn. Then she pointed Luis toward the hallway outlet, asked 2 volunteers to shift trays, and told Dane she appreciated the offer, but they were going to finish the dinner they had started. She did not say it dramatically. She did not make a speech. She simply chose, in front of everyone, and somehow that felt more dangerous than any speech would have. Dane's face stayed polite, but something in his eyes tightened. I pretended not to notice because Tess had not chosen me as a weapon against him. She had chosen a plan that let her remain herself. The next 30 minutes became heat, motion, and controlled risk. Mara ran the serving line like a battlefield nurse. Luis took his new job with terrifying seriousness and told one volunteer that if she plugged in the cocoa machine, Bram would be disappointed in her, which was apparently enough to stop her. Tess moved beside me, checking trays, marking times on the back of a napkin, calling out instructions that were sharp without being cruel. I kept one hand on the oven handle and one eye on the breaker, listening to the hum change every time the load shifted. It was not fixed. It was surviving. Some nights that was enough. When the second full round of trays came out hot, the dining room broke into a little wave of relief. Not applause exactly, but the sound of chairs moving, people laughing again, children being told to wait their turn, plates landing on tables. Tess stood near the oven with a towel in her hand, watching the food move out of the kitchen like she did not trust it until she saw it reach people. Her face softened in a way I had not seen all night. She looked exhausted and bright at the same time. Then she reached for a tray before I could warn her the side lip was hotter than it looked. She caught it wrong and sucked in a breath through her teeth, dropping the towel onto the counter. I moved before I thought. I took her wrist carefully, turned her palm up, and saw the angry red line blooming across the base of her thumb. Tess tried to say it was nothing, because, of course she did. I told her if she said she had survived worse, I was reporting her to every nurse she had ever judged. That got a small laugh out of her, but her hand trembled against mine. I guided her to the sink and ran cool water over the burn. For once, she let me. The kitchen kept moving around us, but the space between her body and mine became too quiet. I held her wrist gently, my thumb resting below her pulse, and felt the fast beat there. She watched my face instead of her hand. I told her the burn was minor, but she needed to stop grabbing hot metal like the laws of physics were personally negotiable. Tess said she had a bad habit of assuming she could handle things if she moved fast enough. I said I had noticed. She smiled, but it faded when I wrapped the burn with gauze from her own first aid kit. My fingers were careful because I had to make them careful. There were flour marks on her sweater, steam-curling pieces of hair loose around her face, and tiredness under her eyes that made me want to tell everyone in the building to leave her alone for 10 minutes. Instead, I secured the bandage and said she was done lifting trays. She raised an eyebrow and asked if I was giving medical orders to an ER nurse. I told her no. I was giving equipment preservation orders to the most stubborn part of the kitchen. Tess looked down at our hands. My fingers still held hers, though the bandage was finished. I should have let go. I knew that. I also knew she was not pulling away. For a moment, the shelter, the oven, and Dane's polished voice all moved to the edge of the room. Tess said quietly that I had not taken over. I asked what she meant, even though I did. She said I gave her a way to choose without making her feel small. There were things a man could hear and stay defended against. That was not one of them. I looked at her hand in mine and said that she had already been leading the room before I got there. I only moved a few plugs around. Tess's eyes lifted, and the look in them made that old, scared part of me step backward even while my body stayed where it was. She said I always did that. I asked what. She said I turned something kind into something smaller before anyone could thank me for it properly. Before I could answer, Dane's voice came from near the doorway, low enough that only we were meant to hear, but clear enough to land. He said Tess always had confused rescue with love. Tess's hand tightened once inside mine, and I felt the sentence hit both of us in different places. Dane's sentence should have belonged to him. It should have stayed in his mouth, small and polished and bitter. But some sentences know exactly where to go. Tess always had confused rescue with love. It slipped past Tess first, because she was used to fighting him. She had old defenses for his voice, old scar tissue for the way he could make concern sound like correction. I did not. The words went straight to the place in me that already suspected I was only valuable during emergencies, only lovable when something was on fire, leaking, broken, or about to disappoint a room full of people. Tess turned toward him, her bandaged hand still close to mine. She said his name in a warning tone, low and tired, but I had already let go, not dramatically. That would have been easier to notice and stop. I simply released her hand, stepped back, and picked up the towel from the counter like the towel had become urgent. I told her the wrap should hold, but she should keep it dry. She looked at me then, really looked, and I saw her understand that something had shifted. That made it worse. I did not want to be another thing she had to manage tonight. Dane said he was only trying to keep her from repeating a pattern. Tess told him that if he wanted to be useful, he could start by not diagnosing her in a kitchen full of volunteers. Mara appeared behind him before he could answer, carrying an empty tray like she was considering whether it could become a weapon. She said the dessert table needed bodies, not philosophy. Dane gave one last civilized smile and left the doorway. Tess stayed where she was, watching me instead of him. I should have said something honest right there. I should have told her Dane was wrong, or that I wanted him to be wrong, or that hearing him say it had made me feel like every useful thing I had done that night had turned suspicious in my own hands. Instead, I said I needed to check the breaker again. Tess glanced toward the panel, then back at me. We both knew the breaker was fine. The oven had been holding steady for 20 minutes. Still, she let me walk away, maybe because she had guests waiting. Maybe because she knew chasing me in that moment would only make me run harder. The hallway behind the kitchen was colder than the dining room and smelled like salt from wet boots, old paint, and the faint metallic scent of overworked radiators. I found the breaker panel near the back exit and opened it because a man can look purposeful in front of almost anything with switches. I stared at the labels without reading them. Freezer. Kitchen left. Kitchen right. Hall lights. Half of them were written in marker over older tape, a history of fixes layered over fixes, which felt too familiar to be funny. Behind me, through the wall, I could hear the dinner finally working. Plates. Voices. Somebody laughing hard enough to cough. Tess had saved it. Mara had saved it. The volunteers had saved it. I had helped. There was the word. Helped. Safe. Temporary. Clean. I closed the panel and stepped outside through the back door. The shelter's rear lot was small, fenced, and half buried under snow that had turned gray near the dumpsters. Someone had strung old Christmas lights along the chain-link fence, but only every third bulb worked. They blinked weakly against the dark like they were embarrassed to still be trying. I stood under them and breathed cold air until my chest stopped feeling too tight. I told myself I was being reasonable. Tess was emotional because the night was emotional. She had worked a hospital shift, organized a dinner, fought a dying oven, endured an ex-fiancé, and burned her hand. Anyone could mistake steadiness for something more under those conditions. The door opened behind me. I did not turn around. Tess said that if I was actually checking the breaker box from the alley, she had questions about my methods. Her voice was lighter than her footsteps. I said I was expanding my service area. She came to stand beside me, not in front of me, and that small mercy almost undid me. Her bandaged hand was tucked against her coat, snow caught in the loose pieces of hair around her face. For a while, neither of us spoke. Inside, the shelter hummed with the kind of warmth that made the cold outside sharper. Tess finally said Dane knew exactly where to press, and that I should not give him free rent in my head. I told her I was not thinking about Dane. She made a soft sound that meant she did not believe me but was willing to wait. That was another dangerous thing about Tess. She did not always force the truth out of you. Sometimes she simply stood near it until you got tired of guarding the door. I looked at the half-working lights on the fence and told her people usually wanted me most when something was broken. Tess did not interrupt. So I kept going, because apparently Christmas Eve had taken my good sense along with my appetite. I told her about my father's diner. Not the whole story, just enough. The freezer that died on a Saturday rush. The stove burner we lit with a match for 3 months because replacing it cost too much. My father coughing in the office with invoices spread out in front of him, still asking if Table 6 needed more coffee. I told her I fixed everything I could touch, and when the diner closed anyway, people kept telling me I had done enough, but enough had not saved it. Tess was quiet beside me. I could feel her listening, not waiting for her turn, not preparing a comforting phrase, just listening. That made it harder to keep my voice even. I said after that, I got good at being the man people called in a crisis. It worked because a crisis had rules. Something broke, I fixed it, people were grateful, and then I left before anyone could forget why they wanted me there. I tried to make it sound like a joke at the end, but it came out wrong. Honest things usually did when I had not rehearsed them. Tess turned toward me then. She said my name once, quietly. I told her Dane might be an ass, but he was not inventing the question. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she was grateful. Maybe I had shown up at the right time with the right tools and the right wounded animal face. And tomorrow, when the oven was cold and the shelter was cleaned and her burn stopped hurting, she would realize she had only needed help. I said all of that while looking at the fence, because looking at her would have made me stop too soon. She waited until I had run out of words. Then she said that she had almost knocked on my door in October when she saw me carrying groceries upstairs with one bag splitting open and pretending you could outwalk gravity. I looked at her despite myself. She said she had almost knocked the night my smoke alarm chirped because after I fixed it, she heard me laughing alone at something on your phone and wanted to know what it was. She had almost knocked the week before Thanksgiving because I came home with motor oil on my sleeve and looked so tired I put my key in the lock upside down. Each time, she said, she found a reason not to. Too late, too awkward, too neighborly, too much like admitting she had been listening for me. I did not know what to do with that. Tess smiled a little, but her eyes were bright. She said the oven was the first excuse big enough to make her brave. Then she looked down at her bandaged hand and added that if usefulness were all she wanted, she could have called 3 other people before me. I asked why she did not. She said because none of them were the man across the hall who tightened the loose stair rail without telling anyone, who left a spare bulb by the elevator after Mrs. Ivers complained about the light, who pretended not to care and then cared in the most inconvenient, practical ways possible. I wanted to believe her so badly that it scared me. That was the plainest truth. Wanting is one thing when you keep it quiet. It can live in the hallway, in jokes, in borrowed tools, in the safe space between almost and never. But once someone stands in the snow and tells you they have been choosing your door in their mind for months, wanting becomes a thing with consequences. I told Tess I did not know how to be wanted when nothing needed fixing. She stepped closer and said maybe I could start badly and let her complain about my technique. That surprised a laugh out of me, rough and small. Tess looked relieved, but she did not turn it into a joke. She lifted her uninjured hand and touched the front of my coat, just above the zipper, not pulling me in, not pushing for more, only letting her fingers rest there like a decision. She said she was tired of being admired for how much she could carry. She was tired of people calling her strong when they meant convenient. Dane had loved her competence until it stopped serving his version of her. But tonight, she said, I had not tried to make her smaller, and that mattered more than the oven. The back door opened before I could answer. Mara leaned out with her red scarf crooked and her expression carefully innocent, which meant she had probably been listening long enough to become a legal problem. She said she hated to interrupt whatever emotional weather system was happening by the dumpsters, but the dinner was ready for the final thank you, and Tess had promised to say something before dessert disappeared into the public. Tess closed her eyes for 1 second. I told Mara her timing was terrible. Mara said love and logistics were both built on terrible timing, then vanished back inside. Tess did not move right away. She looked at me, and I could see the question there. Not demanding, not solved, but open. I told her she should go. People were waiting. She nodded, but before she turned, she said this was not finished. I said I knew, and for once I did not make it smaller. Inside, the dining room had softened into the afterglow of a crisis survived. People sat with full plates, kids leaned sleepily against adults, and volunteers moved with that loose exhaustion that comes when the worst does not happen. Tess walked to the front near the crooked Christmas tree Mara had decorated with paper stars. I stayed near the back, beside the kitchen entrance, because that was where I knew how to stand. Tess thanked Mara first, then the volunteers, then the guests for trusting them with the night. Her voice was steady, but when she paused, her eyes found mine across the room. And suddenly I understood, with my heart climbing into my throat, that she was about to say something she could not tuck safely back into the hallway. Tess stood at the front of the shelter with one hand tucked carefully against her side and the other resting on the back of a folding chair. The crooked Christmas tree behind her blinked unevenly, throwing little flashes of red and green over the paper stars that some kids had made earlier in the week. The room quieted because Tess had that effect when she decided to speak. Not because she demanded attention, but because people trusted that if she opened her mouth, there was probably a reason. I stayed near the kitchen doorway with flour on my sleeve, 2 bandaged fingers, and the old instinct to disappear before gratitude found me. She thanked Mara first, which was correct and probably necessary for everyone's safety. Mara made a face like she hated public praise, then immediately corrected a volunteer for trying to stack plates wrong. Tess thanked the volunteers, the guests, Luis for guarding the oven with more authority than most city officials, and everyone who had been patient when dinner almost became a rumor. People laughed. Luis bowed from beside the dessert table. Then Tess paused, and the laughter faded into something warmer. Her eyes found me again. I could have looked away. I almost did. But after everything she had said outside, looking away felt like lying. "There's someone else I need to thank," she said, and even though her voice was steady, I could see her thumb press lightly against the edge of her bandage. "He keeps pretending he only matters when something is broken, which is convenient tonight because almost everything was. But he did more than fix an oven. He walked into a mess that was not his, respected the people already carrying it, and made it easier for us to finish what we started." Every part of me wanted to make it smaller. I could feel the joke forming already, something about electricity or duct tape or how the oven deserved most of the credit. That was my oldest exit. Humor, usefulness, step backward, close the door before anyone could see what the warmth did to me. But Tess was still looking at me, and she was not praising a repair. She was offering me a place in the room without asking me to earn it again. So I swallowed the joke. I stood there and let people turn around. I let Mara clap first, loudly and without mercy. I let Luis whistle. I let the woman in the purple hat smile at me like she had known the ending before I had known the beginning. Dane stood near the side wall with his coat over one arm. He clapped, too, because men like him knew when not clapping looked worse. After Tess finished, the room loosened back into motion. Dessert started moving. Kids made serious decisions about pie. Volunteers leaned against counters with the relieved faces of people who had survived a holiday miracle and would complain about it affectionately later. I had just stepped toward Tess when Dane reached us first. He told her it had been a successful night after all, in that smooth voice that always seemed to have a receipt attached. Then he looked at me and said I should enjoy being the hero while the room still needed one. He said it softly enough that most people would miss it, but Tess heard. I saw her shoulders tighten. For once, I did not need her to answer for me. I did not even feel angry, not in the way I had before. Dane had spent the evening trying to name what was happening because if he could name it, he could make it smaller. I knew that move. I had used it on myself for years. I told him I was not the hero. Tess was. Mara was. The volunteers were. Even Luis and his oven laws had a case. Dane's mouth twitched, ready to take that as retreat, so I kept going. I said I also was not Tess's emergency contact only when something broke. That made Tess look at me sharply. My voice did not come out as polished as Dane's, but it came out honest, which was harder. I told her, not him, that I wanted pancakes at odd hours, bad hallway conversations, ordinary mornings, and the right to be there when nothing was wrong. I wanted to be invited after the crisis, before the crisis, and on days when there was no crisis at all. Then I looked back at Dane and said if that made me useful, fine. But I was done pretending useful was all I wanted to be. Nobody around us made a sound for a second. Dane looked at Tess, maybe expecting embarrassment, maybe expecting her to soften the moment into something safe. She did not. She stepped closer to me with that bandaged hand still held carefully, and she said she wanted those things too. Not because of the oven, not because of Christmas, not because she was tired or grateful or confused. She said she wanted them because for months she had been finding reasons to stand in the hallway a little longer, and tonight she had finally run out of excuses to call it accidental. Dane's face changed, not dramatically, just enough to show that he understood he had become irrelevant in a room where he had expected to remain important. He gave Tess a small nod and said Merry Christmas. She wished him the same, kindly but without opening a door. When he left, the air did not explode with victory. It simply cleared. That felt better than victory. It felt like space. Tess and I ended up outside a few minutes later because Mara said if we were going to look at each other like that, we could do it somewhere that did not block the dessert table. The snow had slowed to a soft drift. Behind the shelter, the half-working string lights still blinked along the chain-link fence, stubborn and uneven. Tess stood under them with her coat pulled around her and her bandaged hand tucked between us. I asked if her burn hurt. She said yes, but only enough to keep me humble. I told her nothing could keep me humble after public praise from a woman in a purple hat. Tess smiled, and this time there was no crisis under it. For a moment, we just stood there listening to the muffled room behind us. I thought about my apartment, the cold noodles, the silent phone, the toolbox open on the table like a dare I had not finished accepting. That version of the night felt far away now, but not erased. Tess had not saved me by making loneliness disappear. She had done something harder. She had seen it, knocked anyway, and refused to let usefulness be the only language I was allowed to speak. I told her I did not know how to do this cleanly. She asked what this was. I said being wanted when the oven was fixed. She looked down, laughed softly, then stepped closer until her good hand rested against my chest the way it had by the dumpsters. She said we could start badly and improve through complaints. I said that sounded like a long-term maintenance plan. She said I loved those. I told her I might love one more thing too, but I was trying not to rush the inspection. That made her laugh for real, and the sound hit me in the chest with more force than any confession I could have rehearsed. When I kissed her, it was not dramatic enough for a Christmas movie. There was no swelling music, unless you counted Mara yelling inside that someone had hidden the good pie. Tess rose slightly on her toes, careful of her hand, and I touched her face with the kind of care I usually reserved for fragile things that mattered because they could not be replaced. Her mouth was warm from the shelter air, her cheek cold from the snow. She kissed me like a woman who had spent all night being strong, and had finally found a place to set the strength down without losing it. When we pulled apart, she stayed close. "Still coming with me?" she asked. I looked at the lights, the shelter door, her tired, brave face, and said yes. After midnight, we rode back to our building with foil containers stacked at our feet, because Mara believed leftovers were a love language and possibly a threat. Tess sat beside me close enough that our shoulders touched the whole way. She did not apologize for it. I did not pretend not to notice. At our apartment doors, the hallway looked the same as it always had. Old carpet, scuffed baseboards, one ceiling light I had been meaning to replace. But Tess stood there in it differently now. Or maybe I finally did. She looked at my door, then hers, and said she should probably sleep for 12 hours. I said that sounded medically responsible. Neither of us moved. I unlocked my apartment and pushed the door open. The noodles were still on the counter, completely defeated. My toolbox sat on the table, half organized and waiting. Tess peered in and said my Christmas Eve dinner looked like a health code violation. I told her she was welcome to come in and insult it more specifically over coffee. She smiled then, slow and tired and bright. She stepped across the threshold, and the apartment did not feel empty after that. We had pancakes the next morning at a diner 3 blocks away, because Tess said a man could not declare interest in ordinary mornings and then skip breakfast. She ordered blueberry pancakes and stole my hash browns like it was legally implied. I called Lenora after we got back, and this time I did not let it go to voicemail. Tess sat on my couch pretending not to listen, while listening with her whole face. My sister cried when I told her I missed her. I cried a little too, and Tess only reached over and put her hand on my knee like she was not trying to fix it, only staying. By the next Christmas Eve, the shelter oven had been properly replaced. Luis had promoted himself to assistant operations manager without permission, and Tess had a permanent key to my apartment that she claimed was only for emergencies, breakfast, and judging my laundry habits. The string lights behind the shelter still blinked unevenly, because Mara refused to replace anything that was emotionally committed. Tess and I stood under them after dinner, her hand in mine, and I understood that warmth was not a room other people were born into. Sometimes it was a door across the hall, a knock you almost did not answer, and a woman saying, "You're coming with me," before you were brave enough to ask where. That was the first Christmas Eve I stopped treating loneliness like proof that I belonged alone. What would you have done if you were spending Christmas Eve by yourself and a neighbor knocked on your door saying, "You're coming with me"? Have you ever had someone show up before you were ready to admit you needed them? Tell me your story in the comments. And if this one made you think of someone who saw you at the right time, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.